For the screencast today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about drug action and how drugs work. This is one of my favorite things to lecture about. I teach a number of different substance abuse classes, and one of the ones that I always recommend to students is psychology and physiology of substance abuse. Students love to talk about drugs and how drugs work, but oftentimes their knowledge of how drugs work is grossly misguided. So hopefully today we'll go a little bit into this, but again, you could take a class that would focus on this for the whole semester. You could even dedicate a career to how drugs work and not know everything. So let's get started. What is a drug? Oftentimes you'll see pills like this and think, oh, drug, right? But think about it a little more. Try and define a drug in your head right now. What is a drug? Go ahead, I'll wait for you. Look, it's not that easy. Defining what a drug is quite hard. What about that? That's marijuana right there. Is that a drug? I think most of you would say yes. And that's cocaine. Obviously, that's a drug. And heroin, sure, right? Drug. But what about alcohol? Is alcohol a drug? I would think so. What about these things? Red Bull? Little cappuccino action there or something? Is Red Bull a drug? You'd probably say Red Bull's food. Well, I don't have cigarettes up there. Are cigarettes a drug? Well, now look, we need to talk about this in a little more depth or a little more detail. What about drugs like to treat illnesses or diseases? That's in a whole different category. Now, hopefully some of you thought, okay, definition of a drug. Any substance that changes the physiology of the body. Well, if that was the case, wouldn't water be a drug? Well, what if a drug is something that's used to treat a disease or illness? Well, then alcohol wouldn't be considered a drug, and neither would cocaine. So that doesn't work either. It's really tricky to define what a drug is. And by some definitions, food would even be drugs. But what I'm really concerned about in this class is the brain. So what are drugs called that affect the functioning of the brain? And those are called psychoactive drugs. And when there's any change in functioning of the brain, typically what happens is a change in consciousness or awareness of reality. Sometimes you get a distorted awareness of reality, or heightened awareness, or depressed awareness. Lots of different things can happen. I personally think psychoactive drugs are the most fascinating types of drugs. And it's not just street drugs. There's whole categories of psychoactive drugs that are therapeutic. I'll bet you've heard of antidepressants like Prozac or Lexapro or Celexa. Those are psychoactive drugs. They change the functioning of the brain. And what they're trying to do is treat depression. Or anti-anxiety drugs like Xanax or Valium or Klonopin. Now, that molecule right there is a cocaine molecule. All drugs work because there's a receptor site in the brain for a similar molecule. So this is the dopamine molecule. I mean, it looks different, but it's close enough. And that's the thing, is that every single drug, whether it's an illegal drug or a pharmaceutical drug, works because there's a natural occurring substance in the brain or body that has a similar function, and there's a receptor site for it. So drugs bind at receptor sites, whether it's presynaptic or postsynaptic, or what the action of the drug is. That's very dependent on the specific substance. But go back to your lecture on neurons and neurotransmitters. Drugs bind at neurotransmitter receptor sites frequently. And the big important one that you really need to know about when we talk about addiction is the neurotransmitter dopamine. Every single drug that is addictive either directly or indirectly increases the amount of dopamine in the synapse. So this is called the presynaptic neuron up here and postsynaptic neuron down here. These little bubbles are called vesicles. Those vesicles store the neurotransmitter. The vesicles come down, bind with the cell membrane, and release the neurotransmitter into this gap here. Remember, that's a synapse. And then bind here at the receptor sites. So if you wanted to increase dopamine in the neurotransmitter, or in the synapse, you want to increase the availability of the neurotransmitter, what would you do? Well, if you're a drug, there's a couple different things that you can do. Actually, there's several things you can do. One, you could bind directly to the receptor site. Two, you could cause the vesicles to leak. Three, you could produce more of the neurotransmitter. There's something called reuptake that sucks the neurotransmitter back in and puts it in the vesicle. You could block that from happening. Anything that you can do to increase neurotransmitter levels in the synapse, that's what drugs do. Now, the book is a little simplistic in this, and the book will talk about how each drug works with one specific neurotransmitter or neurotransmitter system, and that unfortunately is not true. Like alcohol, for example, has like 5 mechanisms of action. So it'll increase dopamine, but it'll also increase levels of GABA and other neurotransmitters as well, like glutamate and endorphins. Now, here's the brain. Again, in the first couple chapters, we talked about how different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. So this line right here separates the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is where our thinking and judgment is. Also, our movements come from there. Here is the parietal lobe, sensation, occipital, vision, and then temporal lobe in here. These structures in here are actually subcortical or under the cortex. One of these areas here is called the central reward pathway. Right here. And that's the important thing for addiction. The central reward pathway is rich in dopamine neurons and works with dopamine. So any behavior that you have that is potentially addictive or rewarding increases the amount of dopamine here in this central reward pathway. And the technical name for it is the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. So here's the mesolimbic system, and it starts in this area called the ventral tegmental area and projects out to the nucleus accumbens and then has projections to the prefrontal cortex. This controls our behavior. When we use drugs that are addictive, it alters our behavior here. And drugs that are addictive hijack this central reward pathway because they increase dopamine there so much. Now, behaviors that are rewarding naturally increase dopamine there, like roller coasters or, falling in love, chocolate, sex, gambling, other things like that, eating. You get a pizza and you love pizza, boom, you get a rush of dopamine here. But again, those addictive drugs hijack this area and they increase the levels of dopamine. When you're not using a drug, it depletes the levels of dopamine here. So you're no longer sensing the same level of pleasure that you once had. Now this area, if we look at it in like an MRI, this area will respond to cues so fast, like drug-related cues, that they're outside of conscious awareness. So in order for something to pop into conscious awareness, the signal has to travel to the prefrontal cortex. But here, when the signals reach the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, that's controlling your behavior. That's why addiction is a disease of the brain. It's not a disease of moral character defect or something like that. Here's more pictures of the receptor sites. This is actually showing reuptake. So you can block this little reuptake thing here, and that'll increase levels of neurotransmitter in the synapse. That's how most antidepressants work, like the SSRIs or Prozac. They're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, tolerance is something that you need to know. What is tolerance? Students often get this wrong. They'll say, "Oh, how do you tolerate a drug?" Like they think that it's like, how do you handle the drug? Well, that's sort of it, but not even close. What you need to know is that when you use a drug, you develop tolerance. And there's all sorts of different little types of tolerance, like behavioral tolerance, respiratory tolerance. Each different type of tolerance can develop at a different rate. But when you use a drug, with continued use, you have to use greater and greater and greater amounts of the drug in order to feel the same effect. Or if you use the same amount of the drug, you'll have a reduced effect. That's what tolerance is. Tolerance leads to physiological dependence. That's when your body becomes so adjusted to having a drug on board that it functions normally with the drug on board. And when you don't take the drug, that becomes problematic. When you become tolerant and physically dependent on a drug, the outcome of that is addiction. Now, what is withdrawal? Withdrawal is a process that follows dependence. Withdrawal from a drug, and dependence can happen pretty quickly. Withdrawal from a drug is almost always the exact opposite of the active effects of the drug itself. So if you take sleeping pills at night to help you go to sleep, and you take one the first night, one the second night, one the third night, fourth night you don't sleep very good, so you take two on the fifth night, then you're fine. Sixth night, take two again, and then seventh night, now you're up to 3 pills. What is that? That is tolerance. So you've developed tolerance to that drug. That's a form of dependence. Now, if you just abruptly stop taking that drug, what's going to happen? Well, your body has developed tolerance to that drug. So it counteracts the effects of the drug. It's like a scale, balance, or homeostasis. But when you don't take the drug, things go way out of whack. And that's withdrawal. So you've been taking a sleeping pill to help you go to sleep. You don't take the sleeping pill, you're in withdrawal. What's going to happen at night? Again, it's the exact opposite. So you're not going to be able to go to sleep. That's what withdrawal is. A drug makes you feel calm, like an anti-anxiety drug, like Xanax or Valium. It makes you feel not anxious. So you take that drug, take it. You develop tolerance. You stop taking the drug immediately. You can go into withdrawal. Now, actually, some drugs with withdrawal, that example was Valium and the withdrawal can actually be fatal. Now, it's an anti-anxiety drug, so you're going to go into withdrawal. What are you going to feel in withdrawal? I hope you say anxious. Remember, it's the opposite. But drugs like that can also be used to treat seizures. So if you have a seizure, they'll give you Ativan. Ativan is a drug just like Xanax and Valium, and it treats a seizure. So in withdrawal, it increases the risk for seizure. So drugs, the category of drugs, they're called benzodiazepines. That can be dangerous in withdrawal and even life-threatening. Another category of drugs that's another drug in a category that can be life-threatening in withdrawal that you might not realize is alcohol. So if somebody is physically dependent on alcohol and they stop drinking abruptly, that can be a life-threatening emergency. Other drugs like cocaine and heroin, withdrawal is miserable, but it's not life-threatening. So here's a fun one. Opiates make you constipated. What do you think they do in withdrawal? Answer that one on your own. Okay, so addiction, or psychologists use the term substance dependence or substance abuse. Substance dependence is when your body requires a drug in order to function without a reaction, and that reaction would be withdrawal. So you would have painful withdrawal symptoms if the drug is not present. Now, painful, I wish that word wasn't in there. We should take that out. You would just suffer withdrawal symptoms. Some drugs, again, like opiates, are like decongestants. So when you go into withdrawal, you're going to have a really runny, congested nose. That's not necessarily painful. Okay, so let's talk about some categories of drugs really quickly. Hallucinogens. Hallucinogens typically work with serotonin. They'll have effects on dopamine. Sometimes they work on glutamate receptors. So marijuana is actually in the hallucinogen category. Peyote, that's a cactus. There's lots of new synthetic marijuana-like drugs. So this is like K2 or spice. Technically, they still fall into the hallucinogen category, but they're very mild hallucinogens. Those are psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, opiates. Opiate drugs come from the poppy plant. So it's a flower, actually. So this is the poppy pod here. You scrape the pod, this little stuff oozes out, and you collect it. That right there is opium. From opiates, you can create opioid drugs that can either be synthetic or semi-synthetic, like Oxycontin or oxycodone. Sometimes you'll hear of drugs called hydrocodone. Every time you hear that codone, that's typically it. There are tons of opiate pain drugs in the United States. I'm not even going to go into the list. But they work on the endorphin system or at opiate receptor sites. So the word endorphin really means endogenous morphine. So endo, within, and then orphine or morphine. Morphine comes from opium. And there's also other substances that are also opiates in opium. Codeine is in opium, like codeine cough syrup. And that's where the drug heroin comes from. So heroin is diacetyl morphine, and it was created in a laboratory. You see this right here? It says Bayer. Heroin was created by a chemist at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. That's where you get your aspirin from. Depressants include the benzodiazepines and barbiturates. Those are categories of drugs. Valium and Xanax are two well-known benzodiazepines. They typically work on GABA receptors. Alcohol is a depressant, but again, alcohol has lots of mechanisms of action, but it has strong actions at a GABA receptor. Stimulants. These are bath salts. These have been in the news lately. These are kind of interesting. These are synthetic amphetamines. They're created in a laboratory. They sell these not for human consumption. That's why it's kind of a loophole that they can be sold, but they're still illegal if you use them for human consumption. It's called the Analog Substances Act. And they are amphetamines. Actually, drugs like that kind of scare me because they make them in laboratories God knows where. And, who knows what they put in them. Or if they made any mistakes. It's kind of scary. That's methamphetamine. I should put a slide up here for with Adderall and Ritalin. Those are stimulants that college students are typically familiar with. Caffeine is a stimulant as well. And Coca-Cola is up here because some of you might have heard that Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it. And that's true. It did have cocaine in it in the early days. Not anymore though. But caffeine itself is still a stimulant. And then here's a bottle of cocaine over here. And if you look here, you can see Merck Pharmaceuticals. So Merck did make cocaine pharmaceutically, and cocaine is still used in medicine today, typically with like ear, nose, and throat doctors that are doing nasal surgeries. Not to get people high, but to stop bleeding and to stop pain. So this is a very brief introduction to drug actions. I love this material. If you have any questions, please contact me. And again, I would encourage you to take more classes in this area.